A quiet street, a window with secrets, and one question: who's watching whom? Welcome to the Whimsy Casebook. I am your host, Morgan Finch. I'd love to know, drop a comment sharing where you're joining the mystery from. Your messages bring this casebook to life. Let's begin. It had been raining since early morning, not the kind of dramatic downpour that makes people run for cover, but the quiet, steady kind, a curtain of drizzle that flattened the colors of the street and left a film of gray on every surface. It blurred outlines. It made shoes squeak and collars rise. It filled the air with the smell of wet stone, tobacco and boiled cabbage drifting from kitchen windows. Maigret sat at the table near the stove in his apartment on Boulevard Richard Lenoir, wearing a thick wool cardigan and slowly finishing his second cup of coffee. The kitchen was warm, filled with the homey clink of Madame Maigret's breakfast ritual, the slow folding of a dish towel and the scraping of a knife along bread crusts. No one spoke. They rarely did in the mornings. Through the window he could see the plane trees dripping steadily. A man with an umbrella passed by, the same one who passed at the same hour every weekday, headed somewhere in the 11th arrondissement, Maigret imagined, to a job in an office with bad lighting and an indifferent radiator. He felt no hurry. There were no active cases demanding his attention. His mood was soft around the edges, reflective of the kind that came when he had slept well, eaten simply, and had nothing more urgent than to wait for something he couldn't name. Madame Maigret broke the silence. "That widow on Rue Armand," she said, without turning around. "She's always up before the postman." Maigret looked up. He knew the street was a short, quiet lane near the town, with worn facades and shuttered bakeries. He knew the kind of widow too. Alone in a small flat, rising early, sweeping her windowsill with unnecessary frequency, watching the lives of others. "She kept leaning out yesterday," Madame Maigret went on, as if she were expecting someone, but no one came. He made a soft grunt in his throat, not quite interesting, but enough to keep her talking. "She's the one with the ginger cat. You remember?" Maigret nodded. He did remember. The cat sometimes followed him when he took the long way home in the evenings. There was a pause. Rain tickled softly against the glass. Somewhere in the apartment above, a child started coughing. Maigret stood slowly, stretched his arms, and reached for his pipe. He didn't know yet why he was drawn to the mention of the widow on Rue Armand. Perhaps it was the way his wife had said it, or the simple strangeness of being noticed doing nothing. "I think I'll take a walk," he murmured. Madame Maigret didn't answer, but she watched him from the corner of her eye as he pulled on his heavy overcoat. She had learned not to ask. The drizzle followed him as he left the apartment and walked south toward the canal, hands deep in his pockets. The streets were almost empty. The day had not yet begun in earnest. He passed a woman opening her florist shop, and a deliveryman unloading crates of oranges. A dog barked once, then stopped. When he reached Rue Armand, he paused at the corner. It was an ordinary street. No signs of life, no police cars, no crowd. Just shuttered windows, and a faint smell of frying onions. He looked up. The window was on the 3rd floor, slightly ajar. White lace curtain. Nothing moved. It wasn't official, this visit. He had no call, no complaint, no assignment, but Maigret's instincts, those quiet, stubborn animals that had served him so well, were stirring. Something about that window, or what it looked out on, bothered him, or perhaps it was the simple fact that it had not looked out that morning. The curtain remained still. The cat was nowhere to be seen. He crossed the street slowly. A small cafe on the corner had just lit its sign. He went in, ordered a beer, and sat by the window. He would wait. The cafe was nearly empty, just a man in a rain-spotted mackintosh, hunched over a journal at the bar, and the owner, a quiet Breton with a nose red from drink or cold. Maigret couldn't tell. A faint radio hummed in the background, playing something strings heavy, and the steam from the espresso machine blurred the mirror behind the bottles. Maigret nursed his beer slowly, not because he especially wanted it, but because one did not simply sit at a window without reason. He watched the third-floor window across the street through the drizzle. It had been an hour. At one point a woman with a canvas shopping bag emerged from the building, head covered in a scarf, steps slow and mechanical. She didn't glance at the cafe, nor at the window above. It wasn't indifference so much as absence, as though she had walked this path so often her body could make the journey without her. Maigret lit his pipe and let the smoke curl lazily from his lips, watching it hang in the still cafe air. The act was familiar, comforting, but his eyes never left that window. Still no movement, not even the flutter of the curtain. He had no reason to be here. No report had been filed. No one had died. And yet there was a weight in his chest that wouldn't shift, a quiet insistence that something was out of place. He waited another 10 minutes, then drained his beer, left a few francs on the table, and stepped back into the wet morning. The building was a narrow one, 5 floors with soot-darkened stone, and a small chipped door painted the faded green so common in this part of the arrondissement. It was the kind of place where everything creaked, and everyone knew when someone else was boiling water. Maigret stood in front of the door for a moment, then tried the latch. It opened easily. Inside, the hall smelled of damp wool and floor polish. He heard no sounds, no footsteps, no voices. The walls were a sickly yellow, the color of old bone, and the staircase rose tightly in front of him. It had no carpet, just worn wooden steps with a curve in the middle from 1,000 careful climbs. He climbed slowly, feeling the air shift as he went higher. On the second floor, a door stood ajar, and from within came the sharp smell of vinegar and pickles. An old man sat at a table by the window, back turned, slicing something with great concentration. He didn't notice Maigret. He continued upward. At the third floor, he paused. There were 2 doors, one to the left, one to the right. The right one had a small square of brass with the number 7 scratched into it. The left was plain, unmarked. The window that faced Rue Armand would belong to this left-hand flat. He knocked once, then again, more firmly. Nothing. He leaned closer, listening. Silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from sleep, but something denser, the silence of still air, of absence. He considered pressing his ear to the door, but instead took a step back, lit another match for his pipe, and stared at the wood grain as though it might yield a confession. Finally, footsteps echoed below. A woman's voice, thin and impatient, called out, "You're not the meter man, are you?" Maigret turned. A small, narrow-shouldered woman was climbing the stairs, her shoes squeaking with every step. She carried a bucket and a rag rolled around the handle. "No," Maigret said gently. "I'm sorry to disappoint." She reached the third floor, set the bucket down with a sigh, and adjusted her scarf. "I thought you might be," she said, eyeing him warily. "Madame Reynaud's meter's been broken, keeps clicking all the time. They never send anyone." He nodded toward the unmarked door. "That's Madame Reynaud." The woman gave a slight shrug, but her tone changed, grew guarded. "Yes, third floor left, always sweeping her landing. Wipes the window glass like it's gold. Doesn't talk much." "You the husband?" Maigret smiled. "No, I'm just curious." The woman squinted at him. "She didn't come out this morning." "That's strange. She always puts her milk bottle out by 7. It's still there now, see?" Maigret followed her gesture. Sure enough, a small bottle of milk, unopened, sat neatly to the side of the threshold. Its glass was fogged. He nodded. "You haven't seen her?" "Not since yesterday morning. She had her hair done, I think. Went out with lipstick, came back with none." "Did she have visitors?" The woman hesitated. "A man. In a brown coat. Not a gentleman. Midday. Didn't stay long. Looked like someone from the tax office, or one of those offices that don't have a sign. She didn't seem pleased. Marguerite said nothing. The woman wiped her nose on her sleeve, picked up the bucket. Well, if she's dead in there, I'm not cleaning it. Marguerite gave a soft grunt, not a laugh, just acknowledgement. The woman went on up, her rag slapping against the banister. He turned back to the door and knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. At last he crouched to examine the keyhole. It had been polished recently. No dust, no cobweb. That told him little, but it added to the impression that someone had cared about appearances. He looked once more down the stairwell, then descended. On the second floor, he paused again, knocked on the door from which the vinegar smell had come. After a moment, the old man opened it a crack. His eyes were pale and filmy. Yes, Marguerite nodded politely. Good morning. I'm sorry to intrude. I'm Chief Inspector Marguerite. The door opened a little wider. The man didn't look surprised, just tired. We haven't called the police. I know. I'm not here in any official capacity. Just wondering if you've seen Madame Reynaud today. The man scratched his chin. The widow? No, not since yesterday. But I don't keep track of everyone. Did she seem upset? She always seems upset. That's her manner. A pause. But now that you say it, I didn't hear her sweeping the hall this morning. She always sweeps. 6:30. Like clockwork. Marguerite nodded his thanks. The man closed the door without another word. Back on the ground floor, Marguerite stepped out into the damp air again. The rain had stopped for the moment, though the sky held no promise. He walked slowly back toward the cafe, pausing once to glance up at the third-floor window. Still closed. Curtains still drawn. Inside the cafe, the same man in the Macintosh was now reading a paper, his cigarette burned down to a long trembling ash. The Breton behind the counter raised his eyebrows. Another beer. Marguerite nodded, removing his coat and settling once again by the window. Yes, he said. I think I'll stay a little longer. The second beer went down slowly, not because of hesitation, but because Marguerite was thinking, and thinking often slowed him. He didn't rush thoughts. They moved like smoke in his mind, curling and shifting, occasionally rising into something that felt like shape. He was not at police headquarters. He wasn't wearing his uniformed authority. But even in this quiet corner cafe, he was working. Or rather, something in him was working, an instinct that had settled in, and now refused to be ignored. The man in the brown coat, that had been the cleaning woman's remark. Not a gentleman. Not someone Madame Reynaud expected. Not a friend. Probably not a family member. A visitor who arrived and left without formal announcement, without staying for tea, without being seen again. Marguerite pulled his pipe from his coat pocket and tamped it with slow, thoughtful care. The match flared briefly, casting a glow over his heavy features. He stared out the cafe window again, but not at the window this time. Instead, his gaze traveled down Rue Armand itself, the bakery, the tobacconist, the fruit vendor, with a tilted canopy dripping from the morning's rain. People along these little streets noticed things. Often they didn't realize they had. They absorbed the small details of other lives without effort. The timing of a door closing, a raised voice, a pair of unfamiliar shoes. Marguerite believed in these people, and more importantly, he believed in their half-forgotten observations. He stood, left coins on the table, and stepped back into the open air. The rain had paused, but hadn't left. It loomed above, waiting. The cobblestones were wet and uneven beneath his feet. At the corner the bakery was open and fragrant, the smell of yeast and sugar curling through the doorway like an invitation. Inside, a young woman with tired eyes and flour on her sleeves was arranging brioches on a tray. "Bonjour," Marguerite said, smiling softly. She looked up, nodding cautiously. Bonjour, I was wondering if you might have seen a man here yesterday. Brown coat, late morning, around midday. The woman gave a small frown. I see many men. We get deliveries. The insurance man comes every Tuesday. This one would have come from that building, 3rd floor left, to visit the widow. Recognition flickered in her eyes, faint, but enough. She wiped her hands on her apron. Yes, I saw him. Didn't come in. He stood out front, smoking. Tall, balding, maybe 50, looked nervous. Kept checking his watch. Did he speak to anyone? No, just stood there for a while, then went in. 10 minutes later, he was back on the street, walked toward the canal. Did he seem upset? The woman hesitated. He seemed impatient, maybe even angry, but not in a loud way. Tight. You know the type. Marguerite nodded. He did. He bought a small baguette, unnecessary, but polite, then continued down the street to the tobacconist. This one was older, portly, with thick glasses and a boredom that clung to his every motion. Brown coat, the man echoed. Might have seen him. That street's full of people with brown coats. He went into Madame Raynaud's flat, 3rd floor. The tobacconist scratched his chin. You know, I did see someone around that time. He stood in the doorway, like he wasn't sure whether to knock, kind of jittery. Didn't buy anything from me. Just smoked. Left a stub on the curb. Foreign tobacco. Smelled like cloves. Did you hear anything after he went in? The man shrugged. No shouting, if that's what you mean. But I didn't see him come back out either. Maybe I just wasn't looking. Marguerite thanked him, and left, not surprised by the partial memories. People never noticed as much as they thought, or rather they noticed without remembering. It was only when asked the right question that things rose to the surface. He returned to Rue Armand. The street was still quiet, the widow's window still unmoving. Cat, not the ginger one, but a grey tabby with a torn ear slinked along a drain pipe. The milk bottle remained untouched. He re-entered the building, and climbed the stairs again, slower this time, letting the stairwell tell him what it would. On the 3rd floor, he looked at the unmarked door, then at the other across the hall. Number 7. This time, he knocked. A minute passed before the door creaked open. A young man in a thin undershirt, unshaven, stood in the gap, his expression wary. Yes, Marguerite introduced himself again, quietly. I'm not here officially, just trying to understand something. The man nodded slowly. I don't know the woman well. Raynaud, yes, she never talks. Did you hear or see anything unusual yesterday? Around midday. The man scratched his head, then rubbed at a smudge on his chin. There was someone, he said finally. He rang the bell and knocked, loud, then quieter. I could hear them talking through the wall, not words, just the tone. It wasn't friendly. Did she raise her voice? No, not her, but him. He sounded angry. Or desperate, I couldn't tell. It didn't last long. Maybe 5 minutes, then silence. I thought maybe she sent him away. I heard her door close, that was it. Do you know his name? The young man laughed dryly. No, like I said, I don't know her. She always keeps to herself. Marguerite thanked him, and turned back to the unmarked door. He stood there again, this time longer. Something was wrong. Not just the milk, not just the silence, not just the absence of the ginger cat. It was the silence itself, too perfect, too clean. Like a clock stopped at the right time. He placed his hand on the doorknob, and pressed gently. Locked. From his pocket he pulled a small black notebook. He opened it to a fresh page, and wrote a few lines. Nothing dramatic, just notes, times, impressions. Then he descended the stairs once more, and stepped outside. Across the street, the woman with the shopping bag was returning. She gave him a curious glance. He nodded politely. At the corner cafe, he sat again, now with black coffee in front of him. He didn't drink it right away. He had the beginnings of a picture, not a full one, but enough to know the brush had touched the canvas. A man angry or desperate visits a woman who keeps to herself. They speak. The door closes. After that, silence. Too much silence. Behind him the cafe's radio hummed an old tune. Rain returned, this time softer, more persistent. He took a sip of coffee and stared across the street. The window still didn't move. Marguerite's coffee had gone cold. He hadn't noticed. He had barely touched it. The street outside remained subdued, its few inhabitants moving with the quiet rhythm of daily routine. A boy in a cap passed by pushing a cart with a single crate of carrots, one wheel of the cart clicking with a loose spoke. A woman in a brown coat, not the man in the brown coat of course, but oddly evocative, disappeared into the tobacconist. A dog barked once from somewhere above, then was shushed. Everything looked the same. But Marguerite knew that the sameness was part of it. A life that had stopped moving would leave no noise behind, just stillness. Stillness where there should be movement. Silence where there should be the soft domestic sounds of a woman sweeping her floor, a kettle boiling, the creak of a window latch. He stood up, this time with a sense of purpose. The familiar weight of quiet resolve settled over him, like his coat around his shoulders. He walked out of the cafe and crossed Rue Armand again. Third time that day. And this time, he didn't hesitate. Inside the building, he climbed the stairs, nodding slightly to the old man on the second floor, who glanced up from a plate of bread and herring. At the third floor, he paused only briefly before reaching into his pocket. It wasn't often that he used a tool like this. Officially there should have been a warrant. Unofficially, the city's locksmiths owed him enough quiet favors that he kept a few simple devices tucked away for the rare occasion when silence was preferable to paperwork. The tension in the air was faint, like a whisper behind a door. He worked quickly. A light touch, 2 turns of the wrist, the lock clicked open, with a soft, cooperative sound. He pushed the door inward. The apartment was dark. Curtains were still drawn, though it was midday. The air was musty, tinged faintly with the smell of lavender polish, and something else beneath it, something heavier. Marguerite stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't move at once. He stood and listened, not for footsteps, not for movement, just for atmosphere, for the tone of the room, as if the walls themselves might tell him something. The first thing he noticed was the order. Everything was neat, but too neat. A table had been cleared entirely, though its lace runner was slightly crooked. A cushion on the armchair bore a slight depression, as though someone had sat recently but not recently enough for the warmth to remain. He walked further in. The flat was small. A narrow corridor led to a bedroom on one side, the kitchen on the other. He glanced into the kitchen, spotless, 2 plates drying on the rack, a chipped enamel teapot on the stove, no kettle, no scent of recently boiled water, no milk gone sour. Everything is too clean, too still. On the counter, next to the sink, he saw a small folded note, not addressed, not sealed. He hasn't touched it, not yet, but he leaned in to read what little was visible. The handwriting was delicate. One word stood out: forgiveness. In the bedroom, the bed had been made tightly, military style, but the left pillow was fluffed more than the right, as though someone had lain back against it, then risen in haste. On the floor, near the edge of the bed, Marguerite noticed a single cigarette butt, barely smoked, crushed carelessly. He bent and examined it. Clove tobacco, foreign, unfiltered. The man in the brown coat, he didn't take it, just looked. The window in the bedroom was cracked open. The rain had not reached inside, but the sill was damp. No cat on the ledge, no sign of fur,
food or litter, odd for a woman whose habits seemed otherwise unchanging. Marguerite had seen the ginger cat before, at least twice when walking past in the evenings. It had been part of the picture. Now it is gone. Returning to the living room, he examined the sideboard. Photographs, faded black and white. A man in uniform, presumably deceased. A younger woman, perhaps Madame Raynaud herself, at a seaside town. Nothing recent. No friends, no family gatherings. On a small writing desk, Marguerite saw a calendar. Yesterday's date was circled in red. A single line in small tight script. Appointment noon. He stood still for a long moment, smoking. The pipe smoke curled through the air, mingling with the scent of lavender and aged paper. There were no signs of violence, no struggle, no blood, no broken furniture, yet everything in the room suggested disturbance, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional one. A person who had braced themselves for something, a conversation, an encounter. And then what? Nothing had resumed. The rhythm of life had not returned. There was no milk taken in, no sweeping, no cat fed. He opened the small door to the coat closet near the entryway. Inside hung two garments, a thick grey overcoat, and a light summer dress in plastic covering. No brown coat, no raincoat, just her clothing. On the floor of the closet, neatly placed, were two shoes, women's, worn but well kept. Beside them, a shallow bowl, the kind used for a cat's water, bone dry. Marguerite stepped back out into the hallway, and locked the door behind him. He descended the stairs without pause, and when he reached the street, he stood in the same spot as earlier, looking up once more, at the third-floor window. Still unmoving, still silent. He lit his pipe again, the rain now starting once more light, as before, but steady. Back in the cafe, the bartender looked up, raised an eyebrow. Back again. Marguerite nodded, and didn't speak for a while. He sat, not facing the window now, but facing the inside of the room. The sounds, the weight of wood and glass, and silence. He had what he needed to make it official now. He would return with a team. Quiet, respectful, there would be no sirens, no uniforms, but the door would open again, this time with the full weight of the law. And still what troubled Marguerite most was not what he had seen. It was what he hadn't. No letter sent, no call made, no sign of life, but also no clear sign of death. As though the woman had simply stopped being there. Like a curtain drawn. Not torn. Drawn. The rain followed Marguerite all the way back to the Quai des Orfèvres. By the time he reached the building, his coat had taken on that soaked heaviness that made the shoulders sag and the smell of pipe tobacco cling more stubbornly. He didn't hurry. He rarely did, and today was no exception. If anything, the wet cobbles and grey light seemed to suit his thoughts, slow, quiet, and heavy with something that hadn't yet named itself. Inside, the warmth of the station was not inviting. It was bureaucratic, dense with paperwork, humming with low conversations, and the occasional clatter of a typewriter. Officers passed without greeting, eyes focused ahead. There was no drama, only the day's slow business of crime and administration. He moved toward his office, but paused at the records desk. Behind it sat Inspector Moses, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, tie slightly askew. He was the kind of man who always looked in the middle of something, even when doing nothing. A cigarette hung from the edge of his lip, its ash dangerously long. Marguerite gave a small grunt, by way of greeting. Moses glanced up, nodded, and said nothing. "I need a name," Marguerite said, taking off his coat and folding it over his arm. "Or rather, a possibility." Moses raised an eyebrow, but made no comment, simply stubbed his cigarette out on the edge of the desk, and pushed a large leather-bound ledger toward him. Marguerite opened it to the previous day's entries. "I'm looking for someone who might have visited Rue Armand yesterday. Third floor, number unmarked. A man. Mid-50s. Brown coat. Foreign tobacco. Possibly some kind of government connection. Moses frowned, tapping his pen against the side of his nose. Doesn't narrow it much. No, Maigret agreed, but he wasn't from the neighborhood. That much I'm sure of. Someone with an appointment. Someone Madame Reynaud didn't expect to see, or didn't want to see. At the mention of her name, Moses leaned back slightly. The widow, there's no report on her. There will be, Maigret said. Not yet. I need to understand something first. Moses flipped a few pages in the register. There was a request for an address verification, he said slowly. From the prefecture. Someone asking about residency status. Nothing criminal, but it was tied to raw Armand. Let me see. Here. He turned the ledger around and pointed to a name. Julien Martel, Bureau of Civil Affairs. Submitted an inquiry 3 days ago. Wanted confirmation that a Léonie Reynaud still resided at that address. Standard request, but the note's a little odd. Maigret scanned the entry. There it was, the name, the inquiry, the address. But under remarks, someone had scrawled in pencil. Urgent personal follow-up authorized. He looked at Moses. Did anyone reply to this? Not yet. It was passed to the local records clerk. Scheduled to be returned this afternoon. Maigret nodded slowly. Do we have anything on Martel? Moses turned to another book thinner, dodged and ran his finger down the columns. Julien Martel, born 1902. No record of arrest or disciplinary actions. Employed since 1929 at Civil Affairs. No transfers. Office on Rue de Faubourg, Saint Denis. Married. No children. Maigret absorbed the details like rain into his coat. Not dramatic. Not even suspicious. But the name fits. Is he in today? Moses checked a side sheet clipped to the register. Says he's on leave. Left the office early yesterday. Signed out around 2 in the afternoon. Maigret lit his pipe, though the station's regulations technically forbade it. I think I need to speak with him. He didn't ask Moses to come with him. It wasn't that sort of visit. Not yet. For now he wanted to remain just a man asking quiet questions, guided more by feeling than evidence. By the time he reached the offices on Rue de Faubourg Saint Denis, the clouds had thickened again. The buildings here were more modern, but no less tired. Glass doors with tarnished handles, floors that echoed too sharply when one walked. The Bureau of Civil Affairs was on the 2nd floor. A clerk with bad posture, and a nose like a pickaxe, looked up from a stack of forms when Maigret entered. Julien Martel, Maigret said without ceremony. The clerk blinked. He's out today. I know. I need his file. Professional only. The clerk didn't argue. Something about Maigret's tone, even when not stated with authority, made people comply. Within a few minutes, he returned with a beige folder, tied with a frayed piece of twine. Maigret untied it slowly. Inside routine memos, a photograph, copies of civil inquiries, a personnel record. Martel had been diligent. A man who worked in quiet margins, unnoticed, until someone had circled a name in red on a calendar, and opened the door to something unspoken. There was one document that caught Maigret's eye. A personal correspondence slip, folded yellowed, not part of the official record. It had been addressed to Martel, but the return name was Léonie. He read the brief message twice. It was dated nearly 6 months earlier. Julien, do not come again. I ask this for the last time. There is nothing left between us.
I live quietly. Please respect that. L. He folded the paper and placed it back exactly where he had found it. So, not a stranger then. Not some government errand. Personal, complicated. likely unwanted. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret stood at his window and looked out at the Seine. He smoked in silence. The clouds shifted over the rooftops of Paris like slow-moving thoughts. In his mind, he reconstructed the visit. Martel, a man not given to sudden action, carries this letter in memory. 6 months of silence, of being turned away. Something brings him back, something unyielding. Perhaps a need to explain, or demand, or plead. He stands outside, uncertain. He goes in. They talk. 5 minutes. Not friendly. And then what? He hadn't forced entry. There was no sign of a struggle, no noise, just a silence that began at noon and hadn't yet broken. Maigret turned from the window and picked up the telephone. "Send a team to Rue Armand," he said. "3rd floor. Ask them to be quiet, respectful. No press." He replaced the receiver and sat the creak of his chair oddly loud. He wasn't sure what they'd find. That was the truth. But something had ended there. Something that had already been fading, perhaps, but was forced into stillness by the weight of a visit and a memory that hadn't been welcomed. Maigret leaned back and closed his eyes. Not to rest, but to listen. Inside the quiet, there were always echoes. It was late afternoon by the time the plain grey Peugeot from the prefecture pulled up to Rue Armand. The rain had stopped again, though its presence lingered in the shine on the pavement and the sluggish drip from the guttering. The street was quieter than usual, even for Rue Armand. The shops had pulled in their displays, and the scent of boiled cabbage clung to the walls from some unseen kitchen. Maigret arrived on foot. He preferred it. Cars made too much of an entrance. He wanted the kind of arrival that stirred no curtains. Just a man, heavy overcoat buttoned against the damp, a pipe between his fingers, nodding to the world as if nothing were amiss. He met Sergeant Lapointe near the doorway, a young man with an honest face and a quiet energy Maigret appreciated. Lapointe had worked with him enough to know when not to speak. "You've told them?" Maigret asked. "Yes, Chief. No press, no uniforms at the door." Maigret nodded once. "Good." They ascended the stairs together. On the 2nd floor, the old man with the sour smell and the vinegar still sat at his window, carving something from a potato. He looked up at the footsteps and said nothing. On the 3rd floor, the door was already ajar. Inside, the small team moved carefully. No crime scene tape. No barking orders. Just quiet men in plain clothes, touching little, moving slow. Maigret stepped inside and paused just as before, taking the measure of the room. He watched the men as they moved, one checking drawers without opening them fully, and another shining a small light along the floor, looking for impressions. There was no haste. None of the urgency of a fresh crime. It was an exercise in tone, in preservation. They weren't looking for what was gone. They were looking for what was left. Lapointe lingered near the writing desk. The calendar still sat open. The circled date still whispered. Its quiet emphasis. Appointment noon. Now history. Maigret crossed to the kitchen, eyes drawn again to the folded note on the counter. He picked it up this time. It was not a suicide note, nor was it a confession. Just a single sentence, written in the same delicate hand as the letter he'd seen in Martel's file. Some things can't be undone, only accepted. No signature, no explanation. But it told him something. She was preparing herself, he said aloud, to no one in particular. Lapointe looked up. For what? Maigret didn't answer right away. He moved through the apartment again, letting the atmosphere wash over him. The faint scent of lavender still hung in the bedroom, clinging to the bed linen, though it was fading now. The team had discovered nothing dramatic. No blood, no signs of struggle, no medication missing. The bathroom cabinet was tidy. Its contents were mundane aspirin, soap, and a worn brush. In the living room, beside the cold radiator, someone had pulled back the rug slightly. There, pressed into the wood, was a faint scuff, not recent, but not ancient either. A chair had been moved, perhaps shoved, but it had been returned. One of the men, a quiet fellow named Bertrand, approached Migrate with a small folded handkerchief in a clear envelope. "Found this between the cushions," he said. Migrate took it gently. It was monogrammed with a simple JM. The initials meant only one thing to him now. He nodded. "Martel." Lapointe frowned. "He left it behind, or dropped it," Migrate said. "Or maybe it was left intentionally. People do strange things when they're overwhelmed." He stared down at the cloth for a long time. There was something almost pitiful in it. Not incriminating, just human. A man sits in a room where he is no longer welcome. He speaks. Maybe he pleads. Maybe he demands. Then he leaves. But something of him remains. Not violence, not guilt. Just the small echo of his presence. "Martel loved her once," Migrate said softly. It wasn't a deduction. It was simply true. He felt it in the room, in the letter, in the misplaced handkerchief, in the too silent clock of a widow who had tried to shut the door on a part of her life, and found that it had knocked once more. "Should we bring him in?" Lapointe asked. Migrate turned toward the window. Still no cat. Still the same view of Rue Armand. But now it feels different, like looking into a photograph of a moment that had already passed. "Not yet," he said. "What are we waiting for? For him to come to us?" It was the kind of answer that frustrated younger men, but Lapointe didn't argue. He had seen Migrate wait before waiting, and watching and saying nothing until someone broke the silence themselves. "We leave everything as it is," Migrate said, finally. "Seal the door, not with noise, just quietly. No headlines. I'll speak with the coroner." "She's alive then?" Lapointe asked. Migrate sighed, and looked toward the bedroom. "I don't know, that's the trouble. There had been no sign of her. Nobody. No note of farewell. Just that line, the one on the kitchen counter. Some things can't be undone, only accepted." The phrase echoed in his mind as they stepped back out into the hallway. He gave a small nod to the flat across the way. The door was open now, the young man from earlier watching them from the shadows. "You'll let us know if anyone comes?" Migrate asked. The young man nodded. "Of course." Back on the street, the sky had darkened further, and the wind had picked up just enough to lift the corner of a newspaper left on a bench. Migrate paused outside the building, looking up once more at the third-floor window. He imagined her sitting there weeks ago, watching the street, the lives of others, always apart, always watching. And then a knock. A man in a brown coat, words exchanged behind closed doors, then stillness. Perhaps she had left, fled. Perhaps she was lying somewhere unseen in the apartment, though every drawer had been opened. Perhaps, Migrate thought, she was neither alive nor dead in the conventional sense but changed. A woman who had erased herself without violence, without spectacle, only silence. He turned from the building and began walking. Not to the prefecture, not home, just through the city, its streets shining under the fading light, Paris damp and living, and quietly shifting around him. He would wait. As always, some truths came loudly, but the important ones whispered. The call came the next morning, just after 8, while Migrate was finishing his first pipe and staring at the weathered facade of the building across from his office. He hadn't expected anything so soon. Not because the case felt dormant, it never had, but because such matters rarely moved on anyone's timetable but their own. The voice on the line belonged to a young officer from the small police post at Lagny-sur-Marne, a quiet town to the east of Paris, too far to be suburban, too close to be forgotten. The tone was hesitant, the kind of voice that didn't want to be laughed at for bothering the Quai des Orfèvres over nothing. "We had a woman come in early this morning," the young man said, middle-aged. Thin, quiet. She looked exhausted, Wouldn't say much, asked about train schedules. Then she just sat, for nearly 2 hours. Margaret said nothing, just let the man fill the silence. She had no papers. Carried a cloth bag and a cat carrier. Empty. Asked if there was a local boarding house. One of the sergeants swears he's seen her before, in the city. We thought maybe she was on a list somewhere. Margaret asked for a description. The words came carefully. Grey coat, no hat, wrists like matches. She had the look of someone who had just decided something and wasn't sure it was the right decision. He didn't need more. I'll come myself, Margaret said. Tell her nothing. Keep her comfortable. No questions. The train from Gare de l'Est was nearly empty, and the ride gave Margaret time to think. Outside the windows, the fields were flat and wet with rain, blurred patches of green and brown broken by stone houses and shuttered shops. He didn't read, he didn't take notes. He simply watched the landscape slide past, knowing that sometimes stillness needed to be carried into an encounter like a lantern. When he arrived, the station at Lagny was just waking up. A few men in overalls carried crates across the platform. A woman in a floral dress swept the floor outside a cafe. Somewhere unseen, a church bell rang the half-hour. The police post was modest, just 2 rooms and a desk with a humming radiator. Inside, a young officer stood up immediately and gestured down a short hallway. She's in the waiting room. Been sitting there quietly since 6. Margaret nodded and walked the corridor slowly, pausing outside the doorway before entering. She was there. Madame Raytaud, sitting upright in a wooden chair, her coat folded neatly over her lap, the cloth bag at her feet. Her hands were clasped, fingers white at the knuckles, and her eyes stared straight ahead at a window that looked out on nothing but brick. She didn't look up when Margaret entered. He didn't speak, just crossed the room and sat beside her. They sat like that for some time, minutes, perhaps more. The clock on the wall ticked faintly. Margaret lit his pipe and let the smoke drift toward the ceiling. Finally, she turned her head. I thought it might be you, she said, her voice almost not there. He nodded, but said nothing. I wasn't running, she added. I just didn't want to be in that room anymore. It wasn't mine after yesterday. Margaret let the silence stretch again. There was no need to rush her. I waited for him for months, she said, and then I hoped he wouldn't come. That was worse. The waiting, not knowing whether to lock the door or leave it open. Margaret kept his eyes on the pipe. He came, she continued, and he said everything I thought he would. He asked me to forgive him. He said he still thought of me, that he'd made a mistake marrying someone else, that his life felt hollow. She looked down at her clasped hands, and I said nothing. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't know what he expected. Did he want me to pity him? To open the window and let the past back in? Margaret listened. There was a tremble now in her voice, but it wasn't fear. It was something deeper. The voice of a person who had held something too tightly for too long. He left when I didn't answer, she said. But the room wasn't the same. Even the cat didn't come near me after. It's like he carried all the air out with him. She looked up now, finally meeting Margaret's eyes. I didn't harm myself. I didn't run away. I just left, quietly. Margaret studied her face. It had the thin, sharp quality of someone who had not eaten well or rested much, but beneath that, there was clarity. Pain, yes, but no madness. You left the milk bottle outside, he said softly. She gave the faintest smile. I wanted the neighbors to notice. Isn't that silly? I didn't want to disappear completely. He nodded again. You wrote something on the counter, he said. Her eyes closed briefly. I wasn't even sure I meant it, but it felt right. Some things really can't be undone, can they? No, Margaret said. But they can be understood. She took a breath and let it out slowly. I thought of walking into the river. I did, but I couldn't do that to the cat. The quiet truth of that made Margaret's throat tighten, though he gave no sign of it. She's with the neighbor now, he said. The woman with the squeaky shoes. She seemed pleased to have a companion. Madame Raytaud blinked twice, quickly, and looked back at the window. I suppose I can't go back, she said. Not really. You could, Margaret said, if you wanted to. But there are other places. There's no law against beginning again. I don't want to press charges, she added, suddenly. If you were thinking about Martel. I wasn't. He didn't do anything. That was the whole trouble. He came to apologize. But some things are worse than anger. Pity. Regret. They cling. Margaret stood slowly, tapping out his pipe in a nearby ashtray. I'll speak to the station master, he said. They'll find you a room for the night. No one will bother you. And then you decide. There's no file, no charges, only a door left open. She looked up at him with something close to gratitude, but stopped short of speaking it. Thank you, Inspector. He nodded once, gently, and turned to leave. As he stepped into the hall, the young officer was waiting with a raised eyebrow. She all right? Margaret gave the faintest shrug. She's herself. That's enough. He stepped out into the street again. The rain had begun once more, finer than before, a mist more than droplets. The town was quiet, the cobbles wet underfoot. He lit his pipe and walked slowly toward the cafe near the station, not because he needed coffee, but because it felt right. He thought of the little apartment on Rue Armand, the stillness that lingered in the curtains, the silence in the air. Not all mysteries ended in handcuffs. Some ended with a sigh, or a train ride, or a whisper between strangers in a waiting room. The following morning, Paris wore the look it often did, after a night of rain, not quite washed, not quite refreshed. The puddles in the gutters caught bits of grey sky, and the early trams passed quietly, as though trying not to wake the city. Margaret walked slowly from the Quai des Orfèvres to Rue Armand without speaking to anyone. He declined a ride. It was a walk he preferred to take on foot, and today he needed the distance. He had slept, but lightly, the kind of sleep that folds in on itself, where dreams bleed into memory, and the body doesn't quite believe morning has arrived. Madame Margaret had placed his coffee beside him without a word, and left him alone in the kitchen, as she always did when she sensed something was still working itself through. Now, as he turned onto Rue Armand, the air was damp but still. There were fewer people out than usual. The fruit vendor had not yet raised his awning. The cafe on the corner had only one table occupied, and the baker across the way was inside, visible through the window, slowly kneading dough as if time itself depended on the rhythm. He paused across from the building. Nothing had changed. The same drip from the eaves, the same dull green paint on the door, peeling just slightly near the lock, the same upper window, curtain still drawn. No one looked out. No one ever really did. Inside, the stairwell creaked familiarly beneath his step. On the second floor, the door to the old man's flat was open, and a faint smell of pickled onions drifted into the hall. Margaret nodded in passing. The man gave a small grunt of recognition, but didn't speak. At the third floor, Margaret paused outside the unmarked door. He had the key now. Officially, Lapointe had left it with the clerk the evening before. There had been no more questions, only a quiet agreement that the apartment would be entered one last time before being sealed, not as evidence, not as a crime scene, but as something softer, a space in transition. The key turned with a metallic click, and the door opened without resistance. Inside, the room had not changed. The men had done their work respectfully. Nothing was out of place. The note still lay folded on the counter.
The calendar still bore its quiet red circle. The air was motionless, as though it had decided not to stir without permission. Migrate walked slowly through the rooms, his pipe unlit in one hand, the other resting at his side. He didn't inspect so much as to be present. There was nothing to discover. What had mattered had already been revealed, if not spoken aloud. The bedroom was dim with drawn curtains, but the edges of the room were softened by morning light pressing through the fabric. The bed had not been disturbed further. The small depression in the pillow still lingered, like the ghost of a conversation. On the writing desk, he found a small postcard tucked into a drawer. It showed the beach at Trouville, pale skies over a flat sea. No message on the back, just the printed name and the word souvenir in delicate script. He held it a moment, then replaced it exactly where it had been. The cat's bowl remained dry. In the closet the shoes were still lined up neatly, the summer dress still sealed in its plastic sleeve. There was something unbearably human about that, not worn recently, but not discarded. A part of her life kept for reasons that even she may not have understood. Memory often lived in fabric more than in photographs. He returned to the sitting room and stood near the window. From here, he could see the cafe across the street. A man leaned at the counter, nodding along to a newspaper. A woman passed with an umbrella, though it had not rained yet that day. Everything appeared as it had before. He exhaled slowly, not quite a sigh. Some apartments remembered their occupants. He had known rooms that resisted emptiness, where the absence of footsteps or voice was louder than sound. This one was quieter, more resigned, as though it had accepted the silence, as though it had always known it would be left behind. He lit his pipe, though he wasn't supposed to smoke indoors. The smoke wound its way toward the ceiling and hovered there. From his coat pocket, he removed a small envelope. Inside were the keys, the originals, and the note that had been left on the kitchen counter. He didn't open it, just held it, then placed it gently on the table, beneath the calendar. He turned to go. At the threshold, he looked back once more, taking in the space not as a detective, but as a man. The traces of life were still there, not loud, but present. A curtain is drawn, a cushion shaped by a hip, a note written without an audience. He stepped into the hall and locked the door behind him. There was a clerk waiting on the ground floor. He handed over the key without ceremony. "No forwarding address," Migrate said. The clerk nodded. "We'll hold it for 6 months. After that, the agency decides." Migrate said nothing and stepped outside. On the street, the sun had made a brief diffident appearance, casting a faint silver glow over the wet stones. The light didn't last. A breeze pushed a newspaper across the curb, and the sky folded back into grey. He walked down Rue Armand with slow steps, not because he was tired, but because there was no need to move quickly anymore. At the cafe, he paused. The bartender looked up and gave a polite nod. "Your usual." Migrate hesitated, then shook his head. "Not today." He stood by the window instead, pipe between his teeth, hands deep in his coat pockets. From this angle, the apartment window was barely visible, just a square of stillness behind fabric. There would be no formal report, no charges, nothing to file, just the silent understanding that something had been carried to its end, not with violence, not even with sorrow, simply with the quiet decision to turn a page. He thought of the young officer at Lagny, the waiting room, and the empty cat carrier. The way Madame Raynaud had spoken, like someone who had learned the weight of silence the hard way and decided not to carry it anymore. He had seen guilt before. He had smelled it, heard it in voices, seen it in the eyes of men who had crossed a line. This wasn't that, this was something else. The kind of story that could only be known by its ending. He left the cafe without entering and continued walking, the city pressing close around him in its usual way, quiet, wet, and filled with lives carrying on just beyond notice. Tomorrow, there will be another case, another face, another apartment where silence meant something. But today, there was only the memory of a window that no longer watched, and a woman who had once looked out from it, and decided, finally, to look inward instead. It was nearly midday, when Migrate returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the weight of the morning still pressed into his shoulders, like the dampness of the coat he had not yet removed. He passed through the familiar halls without pause, nodding at clerks and constables, none of whom expected him to speak. His pace was deliberate, steady. There was no case to solve now, not officially. But something in the rhythm of the past few days had not yet settled. His office was warm, the radiator clanking faintly in protest, as if it resented being needed this late in the spring. A small stack of folders waited on the edge of his desk. Petty thefts, a minor quarrel at a restaurant, a noise complaint filed by a violin teacher. But he made no move to pick them up. Instead, he sat down heavily, took off his coat, and lit his pipe. The silence of the room was welcome. It gave him space to think, or not to think. Sometimes they were the same. A knock came at the door, light, almost apologetic. "Come in." It was Janvier, quiet as ever, with a white envelope in his hand. He looked as though he hadn't quite decided whether the contents were important. He held it between two fingers, as though it was still uncertain of its purpose. "This arrived in the early post," he said. "Addressed to Madame Reynaud, Rue Armand. Postmarked 2 days ago. Delivered here by mistake. Someone in the sorting room recognized the name from your inquiry." Migrate took the envelope, said nothing, and waited for Janvier to leave, which he did, with a nod, and no further comment. The envelope was plain, the handwriting small and careful. The stamp was askew. Postmarked from Paris, nothing exotic, nothing rushed. Just another letter, like hundreds that passed through the city each hour. Except this one had never reached its destination. He studied it for a moment, then after a pause that felt respectful, more than hesitant, opened it. There was only one sheet inside, folded in thirds. No photographs, no enclosure. The paper was the kind one might find in any bureau drawer. The scent was faintly of dust and lavender echo, nothing more. He read the letter slowly, twice, then a third time. "Léonie. This is not to plead or insist. I promised myself I wouldn't come again. And yet I find myself writing this, unsure whether you'll even receive it. Perhaps it's cowardice writing instead of coming in person. But I think it's something else. I think I need you to know that I remember. Not only the good, but also what I failed to say. You were right to turn me away. I won't defend the past, but time has not made it clearer. It has made it heavier. That is my burden. I write not to ask for anything, only to tell you I understand now what I couldn't. Then, I know silence was your answer. I will respect it. J. Migrate folded the paper and placed it on the edge of his desk. There was something in that letter that didn't match the man who had knocked on Madame Reynaud's door. Or perhaps it did. Perhaps Martel had written this to soothe his own conscience, only to betray it by showing up anyway. A man who wanted to seem noble, but couldn't resist the human need to be seen, to be heard. The contradiction didn't surprise Migrate. He had seen it in many. Even the quietest lives contained moments of selfishness, disguised as sentiment. He leaned back in his chair, pipe clenched gently between his teeth, smoke trailing upward toward the slow-turning ceiling fan. He imagined Martel writing the letter, folding it, placing it in the envelope, then changing his mind the next day, telling himself the words weren't enough, that the visit would explain more. As if explanations had ever undone what time had already decided. Still, there was something unmistakably honest in the final lines. I know silence was your answer. I will respect it. He hadn't, but perhaps he had come intending to. Margaret stood and walked to the window. Below, the river moved slowly, carrying the weight of Paris on its surface, reflections of buildings, birds wheeling low, the wake of a barge cutting through the grey. The scene was unchanged from the day before, and yet it felt different now, as though a page had turned, even though the story was still being told. He tapped the letter gently on the windowsill, thinking it had never reached her. She had fled the silence, expecting it would consume her. But what if she had read this first? Would it have changed anything? Perhaps not. The letter didn't beg. It didn't ask her to forgive. It merely tried, too late, to share a burden that could not be lifted. He would not send it now. She had left. She had chosen quiet over memory. And he would not deliver the past back into her hands under the guise of closure. Some things, once sealed, were better left untouched. He placed the letter in his desk drawer, not out of secrecy, but out of understanding. It would rest there with others, notes, reports, and fragments of lives that had passed through his orbit and left a trace. Not criminal, just human. The phone rang. He let it ring twice before answering. Margaret. It was Lapointe. We spoke to Martel. He came in this morning. Margaret felt something shift, not sharply, but like a boat bumping gently against a dock. Voluntarily. Yes, said he wanted to explain. Brought nothing but a coat and an umbrella. Said he wouldn't stay long. Margaret exhaled slowly. Hold him there. Don't ask questions. Don't take a statement. Understood. You're coming. Yes, Margaret said. I'm coming. He replaced the receiver and stood again, gathering his coat from the back of the chair. Outside, the day had brightened a little. It wasn't the sun that brightened the day, but rather a distinct clarity. A stillness that felt earned. He left the office quietly, walking once again through the corridors of the Quai des Orfèvres.
Eyes class passed without glancing. The city moved beyond the windows, unbothered by the weight of one man's memory and one woman's silence. Maigret stepped into the light rain. Some mysteries didn't end with answers. Some ended with letters too late, and people too far apart to reach across the time that had grown between them. But still, he would listen. Always, he would listen. The station on Rue de Maubeuge was quiet at this hour, neither at the peak of morning rush, nor yet folding into the dull lull of afternoon. It was a small place with worn floors and old wood, the kind where policemen knew every creak of every door, and kept a flask of coffee warming behind the front desk. Maigret had been there before, though not recently, and its narrow hallways and scuffed baseboards held the kind of familiarity that needed no introduction. When he arrived, Lapointe was waiting, leaning lightly against the edge of a filing cabinet, his coat already unbuttoned and collar open. "He's here," he said, voice low, "asked to speak only to you." Maigret nodded. He didn't ask what Martel had said or how he had behaved. Some things spoke more clearly without summary. They walked together down the corridor. At the end, Lapointe opened the door and stood aside. Martel was seated on the far side of a plain wooden table, a coat folded in his lap, an umbrella resting against his chair. His posture was upright, but not stiff. The lines of fatigue under his eyes were deeper than Maigret had expected, and his hair, already receding, was swept back too neatly. The gesture of a man who had spent too much time in front of the mirror that morning, thinking. He looked up as Maigret entered, but didn't speak. Maigret closed the door behind him and crossed the room slowly. He took the chair opposite and sat, resting his forearms on the table without folding his hands. There was no file, No notepad. There was also no tape recorder present. Just two men in a room that smelled faintly of dust and damp wool. Martel cleared his throat, but didn't begin. "You came," Maigret said finally. Voice calm. Martel gave a small nod. "I thought it would be better." "For her?" Maigret asked gently. "For me." Maigret looked at him without judgment. "I didn't do anything to her," Martel said quickly, almost defensively. "You know that." "I know she left the apartment. I know she left quietly." Martel's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his coat. "I didn't expect her to forgive me. I didn't come for that." Maigret lit his pipe. The first few puffs were quiet, and the smoke curled toward the ceiling, drifting between them. "Then why?" Martel exhaled slowly. "I don't know. I think I wanted her to remember me differently." "She did remember you," Maigret said. "She remembered enough to write to you once, and enough to not want to see you again." "She didn't speak," Martel said, almost to himself. "I said everything I could think of. She just sat there, looked past me. Not angry, not cold, just finished." Maigret nodded. She had prepared herself for the visit. "I think she knew you would come, eventually." Martel looked up, eyes tired. "Then why didn't she stop me? Why didn't she send the letter back?" "She wasn't angry," Maigret said. "That's what made it harder." Silence settled over the room again. Outside the door, footsteps passed, and a typewriter clacked once, twice, then stopped. "I left because I felt ashamed," Martel said after a long pause. "I hadn't felt that in years. I thought, I don't know what I thought. That she'd pity me, maybe. That she'd say she was lonely too. But she wasn't," Maigret said. "No, she had made peace. I was still chasing something I'd already ruined." Maigret tamped the ash in his pipe. He didn't press the man. He didn't need to. "I wrote her a letter," Martel said. "Posted it before I went. Then I went anyway. That was a mistake." Maigret reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the envelope. Martel's eyes widened slightly. "It never reached her," Maigret said. "Delivered here by mistake." Martel reached for it, but stopped halfway, withdrawing his hand. "I don't need to see it," he said. "I remember every word." Maigret placed the letter on the table and left it there. "You don't want to send it now. She's gone," Martel said. "Wherever she is, she doesn't need it. And I've said enough already." They sat in silence once more. Then softly Maigret said, "You didn't harm her, but you frightened her." Martel looked down. "I didn't mean to." "I know," Maigret said, "but she had built a life around silence. Your words made too much noise." The man nodded slowly, then stood, coat still folded in his arms. "Will you arrest me?" Maigret shook his head. "There's no charge, no complaints. You didn't break any law." Martel hesitated at the door. "Do you think she'll come back?" "I don't know," Maigret said truthfully. "But if she does, it won't be for you." Martel gave a small broken smile. "No, I know." When the door closed behind him, Maigret remained seated for a long while. The room was still, the echo of the conversation settling into its corners like dust. He stared at the letter, still on the table, unopened now in a different way. He folded it and placed it back into his coat. Later in his office, he would file it away with the other documents of moments where lives had shifted slightly, barely noticed, like cracks in a wall that only widened with time. It is over now. The case that wasn't a case. A visit, a silence, a decision made in a quiet room above Rue Armand. He would never see Madame Raynaud again, he suspected. She had chosen her ending, not dramatic, not tragic, but deliberate. A quiet walk into another life. Maigret stood, stretched and walked to the window. Paris moved below, steady and unchanging. People were walking to work. Shops are opening. Bread cooling on wire racks behind frosted glass. He lit his pipe one final time and leaned against the sill. A man had come hoping to rewrite the past. A woman had chosen not to let him. No crime. No arrest. Just the sound of footsteps fading down a hall, and the memory of a window that had once watched over Rue Armand, then turned away. It was evening now, and the sky above Paris had shifted into one of those bruised palettes of purple and ash grey that arrived after a long day of intermittent rain. The city had that slick sheen it wore so well, its rooftops shining faintly in the last light, its narrow streets reflecting the yellow glow of street lamps just beginning to flicker on. Maigret walked without hurry. No one had summoned him, and nothing waited at his desk that couldn't wait another day. He had left the station not with the sense of finishing something, but with the weight of something laid gently to rest. There had been no report to write, no file to close, no crimes had been committed in any official sense, but something had passed through his hands all the same, delicate and human, like a letter misplaced in the post. His path took him along the quiet side streets of the 11th arrondissement, where the shuttered fronts of cobblers and seamstresses stood beside tabacs, still lit with humming neon. In one window, a man shaved his face with slow, practiced strokes. In another, a woman folded linens under the yellow light of a bare bulb. Paris, as always, kept living, never knowing who was watching. Eventually, he reached the small café near Square Maurice Gardet, a place he liked for no particular reason, except that it never asked anything of him. The barman, a broad-shouldered man with thinning hair and a disposition as steady as a clock, greeted him with a nod and said nothing. He poured a glass of beer without being asked and set it down on the table near the window where Maigret always sat when he came alone. Maigret removed his coat, letting it drape over the back of the chair, and settled into the seat with a long exhale that wasn't quite a sigh. He did not yet touch the beer. Instead, he looked out at the street. It was not Rue Armand, but it might as well have been. The same slow rhythm. The same worn buildings with iron railings, the same windows that kept their secrets behind heavy curtains. A small car passed, its tires hissing over the wet cobbles. Somewhere across the way, a radio played a chanson from the 1930s, the soft warble of a woman's voice rising faintly through an open window. He thought of Madame Raynaud, of her thin wrists and steady eyes. On the way she had sat in that waiting room in Lagny, coat folded neatly, bag at her feet, not afraid, not lost, just apart. She had not asked to be followed. She had not explained herself. She had merely spoken plainly, like someone telling the weather, and Martel Maigret had seen his kind before. Not cruel, not dangerous, but dangerous too. The kind of man who believed the past owed him resolution, even when he had been the one to sever it. He hadn't intended harm, but his need to be seen had reached out like a hand across a still pond, and the ripples had done what hands could not. They had unsettled everything. Now it is over. There had been no body, no arrest, only an ending that could not be described in paperwork. He took a sip of beer. It was cold, bitter in the right way. He let it sit on his tongue for a moment, before swallowing. Around him, the café held the quiet life of ordinary people. A couple at a corner table spoke softly, their conversation broken by gentle laughter. A man in a blue smock nursed a glass of pasties and flipped through a newspaper. Someone smoked near the doorway, the tip of his cigarette glowing briefly each time he inhaled. And Maigret sat, watching, as he always had, not waiting for something to happen, just noticing that it did. He wondered where Madame Raynaud had gone. Perhaps a boarding house on the outskirts. Perhaps to stay with someone from a long-forgotten chapter of her life. Or perhaps nowhere in particular, just away. And the ginger cat, Margaret liked to imagine it curled in the lap of the cleaning woman, eating scraps of ham from her plate, unaware of the small tragedy it had padded through. He remembered the letter, and Martel's quiet too-late attempt at decency. "You were right to turn me away. I understand now what I couldn't then." Words that tried to rewrite silence, but arrived only after silence had already spoken. Margaret would not send it on. It would sit in his drawer with others like it, unsent apologies and unfinished stories, the kind of truths that lived better in private. He drank again. Rain returned, just a whisper at first, then steady, pattering against the cafe awning, and dotting the windows with soft streaks. The street outside shone once more, and passers-by lifted their collars or reached for umbrellas in automatic, practiced motions. Margaret leaned back, letting the warmth of the room and the hush of the rain settle over him. He was not a sentimental man, but he felt something close to melancholy, though not quite sorrow. A quiet sadness for all the unfinished conversations in the world, for the letters that never arrive, for the people who leave not because they must, but because there is nothing left to wait for. In his mind, Rue Armand remained as it had been that first morning, grey, wet and unmoving, a window slightly ajar, a milk bottle uncollected, a silence that had said more than any confession. He imagined her still walking, not fast, not afraid, simply forward. He thought of a line she had written, still resting on that kitchen counter: "Some things can't be undone, only accepted." Yes. He finished his beer. The rain thickened. Across the street, someone pulled a curtain shut. Margaret reached for his coat, not out of urgency, but with the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing there was nothing more to find. Not today. He would walk home in the rain. Madame Margaret would have soup on the stove. She might ask if he had eaten. He might say yes, and nothing more, because sometimes the story ended not with a revelation, but with understanding. A woman had left a room, a man had entered it too late, and Margaret, as always, had been there to witness the silence between them.